And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Okay, well, welcome to the marine segment here. Ice edge showing ice retreating northward and doing a slow dissolve here, Nunivak Island along the southwest coast in toward Bristol Bay, and it'll continue to do so for the next 2 or 3 days likely. And going on to tonight's weather, a lot of windy conditions here. You can see quite a few lines across the map here right into the western interior areas. High wind warnings out tonight, St. Lawrence Island, Bering Strait coast, and also for the lower Yukon River Valley for winds gusting 60 to 65 miles an hour. This front weakening as it pushes wind and rain into the eastern Aleutians, and very windy conditions, gale force and storm force winds associated with that low back to the west. That pulls northwestward for Monday, staying very windy out here over the Aleutians, western Bering Sea, wettest over the west side there in toward the low center. Drier with less wind now, pushing in behind this weakening front that's starting to hang up along the coast. A new low developing here keeps it very windy and wet, Kodiak Island, the Alaska Peninsula. And then for Tuesday, that low slips off to the southeast. This front reaches the coastline, possibly, give or take there, but hangs up right along the coast, weakens, areas of light rain and snow, Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, across the southwest interior to St. Lawrence Island, and much better conditions behind the front and less wind and showery for the Aleutians. This low pulling back to the Komodorsky Islands there. Strong high pressure keeps it dry with light winds over the central, northern interior, right on down in the Gulf of Alaska and the southeast coast. East winds 15 knots for the south coast, not much different for the north coast. East winds 10 to 15 knots there. Small craft advisories though for Monday, Lynn Canal into Stevens Passage. Actually those winds starting to pick up during the night tonight. And north 15 for Clarence Strait. And then those fall back on Tuesday, north 15 to 20 knots for Lynn Canal and Glacier Bay and Stevens Passage, northwest at 10 for Clarence Strait. East winds on the south coast at 10 knots, and the north coast, east-northeast, 10 to 15 knots. Northeast at 10 for Prince William Sound tomorrow. That's where the lightest winds will be. Otherwise, the eastern North Gulf Coast, east winds 15 to 20 knots, 30-knot northeast winds there for the western coast. And gales, east 40 knots, Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, Cook Inlet, northeast 20 to 30 knots. And for Tuesday, Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds 15 to 30 knots. Storm warnings in the forecast here for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, east winds 50 knots. And variable winds at 10 knots for Prince William Sound, variable winds 10 to 20 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast, northeast at 30 there for the west side. Kodiak Island, gale warnings tomorrow, east winds 35 knots. East-southeast 40 to 45 knots here for the Alaska Peninsula, and a strong east wind at 40 knots for Bristol Bay. Then on Tuesday, lighter winds, south to southeasterlies 20 to 25 knots for the peninsula, Bristol Bay, southeast at 30 knots, and easterly gales for Kodiak Island. Fox Island, southeast tomorrow, 30 to 40 knots with the strongest winds around the Kulski. Storm warnings, Adak and Atka, all the way over here to Amchitka Island, south to southeast at 50 knots there. Low center right here around Kiska Island, so to the west, you're looking at north to northeast winds at 30 to 40 knots. And then for the day on Tuesday, south winds, 30 to 40 knots, west of Adak and Atka specifically, south at 25. And for the eastern Aleutians, south to southeast winds 20 to 30 knots. Up along the southwest coast tomorrow, south of Nunivak Island, storm warnings. Southeast winds 50 knots, gale warnings for the Yukon Delta coast, Norton Sound, and St. Lawrence Island. East winds 35 knots, east at 45 knots for St. Matthew Island, southeast at 40 for the Pribilofs. And then for Tuesday, lighter winds, but still looking at some pretty good gales here for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, southeast at 30 knots, and brisk wind advisories, Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, and Norton Sound, east winds 30 knots, gale warnings, St. Matthew Island, southeast at 35, and southeast 25 for the Pribilofs. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, or the central and east side, east to southeast winds at 10 knots, picking up about 15 knots, western Arctic coast, and brisk wind advisories for the Chukchi Sea for 25 to 30 knot winds. Those turn east, or mostly east, 25 knots for the Chukchi Sea on Tuesday, east 15 for the western Arctic coast, and northeast at 10 on the central coast, and a light westerly breeze at 5 to 10 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coastline.